I woke up to my phone vibrating nonstop on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with missed calls and furious voicemails from people whose names I didn't even recognize. Messages overlapped one another, voices shouting, accusing me of destroying the entire community, before I'd even had a chance to fully wake up. When I stepped outside, the sky was still dim, that uneasy gray right before sunrise. The street was already crowded. Neighbors stood in bathrobes and slippers, clutching empty water jugs like proof of some crime, their faces tight with panic and anger. And there, perfectly placed at the center of it all, stood the HOA president. Crisp blazer, composed posture, a smile so calm it felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. "Congratulations," she said evenly, her voice cool and authoritative. "You just shut off water to over 500 homes." I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked straight at her. "No," I said quietly. "I shut off one intake valve on my own land because somebody's been stealing from my family for years." Before she could respond, engines rumbled behind her. 2 white trucks pulled up first, marked for state water enforcement. Then a third vehicle rolled in, darker, heavier, with clear federal markings on the side. That was the moment her smile finally disappeared. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I never expected 1,000 acres to land on my shoulders all at once. Responsibility didn't arrive with a ceremony or a signature. It came with a phone call from a rehab facility and a doctor speaking in the careful, measured tone people use when they already know your life is about to change. My father, Frank Dalton, had suffered a stroke. It left one side of his body weak and his speech slower, but it did nothing to soften his will. Even lying in a hospital bed, he argued with the nurses, corrected the doctors, and reminded anyone who would listen that the land had survived worse than this. To him, the property was never just acreage on a map. It was memory, pine-covered slopes that smelled like sap after rain. A quiet lake that reflected the sky so cleanly it looked unreal at dawn. A narrow creek fed by a natural spring, winding through the valley like a living thing. My father used to say the water was the heart of it all. "You take care of the water," he'd tell me, "and the land takes care of you." That belief shaped my entire career. I became a water systems engineer and spent more than 2 decades working on infrastructure projects most people never think about unless something goes wrong. I've stood in control rooms at 3 in the morning, staring at pressure charts while entire towns slept, unaware that one failed valve could leave them dry by sunrise. I knew how fragile systems really were. I also knew how often power hid behind pipes, permits, and paperwork instead of brute force. So when my father's doctor told me he couldn't live alone anymore, I didn't debate it. I packed my truck, cleared my calendar, and drove back to the family land near the small, forgettable town of Cedar Basin. It felt like stepping backward in time, except this time the responsibility was mine. My daughter Lily came with me. Her mother and I shared custody, and this was my stretch. Lily was not thrilled. She stared at the mountains like they were a punishment and scrolled endlessly through her phone, searching for a signal that barely existed. "There's nothing here," she said the first night, standing on the porch. It's like living inside a postcard nobody asked for. Still, she came. She helped unload boxes. She learned how to move quietly around her grandfather's wheelchair, and even though she complained, she paid attention. I didn't realize how important that would become until much later. The first week passed in uneasy calm. I focused on settling my dad, setting up routines, making the house livable again. But small details began to nag at me. Tire tracks near the creek that didn't belong to us. Bright survey stakes hammered into the ground where no survey had ever been done before. A wooden sign nailed near the trailhead that read, "Community Access," as if someone had quietly rewritten the rules while we weren't looking. On the 8th morning, the message became impossible to ignore. I was repairing a loose rail on the porch when I heard the electric hum of a golf cart climbing our gravel drive. It moved slowly, confidently, like it had every right to be there. The woman who stepped out looked nothing like the stereotype people joke about. Vanessa Rourke was polished, composed, and dressed like she'd walked out of a corporate boardroom rather than onto a rural property. She smiled easily, but her eyes never stopped measuring. She introduced herself as the president of the Silver Pines Ridge Homeowners Association, as if that title alone explained why she was standing on my land. She handed me a thick folder and spoke in a tone that was warm without being friendly. "Welcome back to the community," she said. "I just need to review a few compliance matters with you: shoreline usage, dock restrictions, and the updated water sharing agreement." I told her plainly that there was no water sharing agreement. I'd know. Water was my profession, and this land had never shared its supply. Vanessa didn't argue. She didn't even look surprised. She tapped the folder lightly, like the truth lived between those pages whether I believed it or not. "It's recorded," she said. "And now that your father has been relocated for medical safety, we need to clarify access going forward." That word lodged in my chest like a splinter. Relocated. My father hadn't been relocated. He'd had a stroke. He'd been taken to rehab so he could learn how to use his own body again. The way she framed it made it sound temporary. Convenient. Like an opening. She continued without missing a beat. "The association maintains the reservoir system that services the ridge. Your land contains critical infrastructure. We have a responsibility to ensure uninterrupted service for the community." I looked past her then, really looked. The golf cart bore the HOA logo. So did the clipboard tucked under her arm. And so did her certainty. That was when the truth settled in, heavy and unmistakable. This wasn't an HOA worried about grass length or mailbox colors. This was something else entirely. This was an organization that believed paperwork could turn private land into public utility. An HOA that didn't see itself as a neighborhood association, but as a governing body. And standing there on my father's porch, listening to a stranger calmly explain my own property to me, I understood that this wasn't going to be a simple disagreement. It was the beginning of a fight over control, dressed up as compliance. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, wrapped in envelopes, and stamped with official-looking logos, the kind designed to make you second-guess yourself before you even finish reading. It started with a thick welcome packet, slid into my mailbox, filled with rules that had nothing to do with reality. Dock permits. Shoreline setback requirements. Amenity access hours. I read that line twice, staring at the lake outside my window, trying to understand how water my family had owned for generations was suddenly being described like a shared clubhouse. Then the letters began arriving one after another, each one a little more aggressive than the last. One claimed my father's boathouse violated the community's aesthetic standards, as if the weathered wood he'd built with his own hands decades earlier was an eyesore that needed correcting. Another demanded I remove a so-called hazardous barrier near the spring. That barrier was a simple old fence my dad had installed to keep cattle from trampling the intake area and contaminating the water. It had protected that spring longer than the HOA had even existed. I responded the only way that made sense. Calmly, professionally. I asked for survey references, recorded easements, and county documentation supporting whatever agreement they claimed bound my land to their rules. I wasn't hostile. I wasn't emotional. I was precise. Vanessa's response came within hours. One sentence. Cold and surgical. Please route all future communication through Association Council. That was when the tone shifted. The fines followed fast, and they weren't symbolic. They were large, escalating amounts designed to trigger fear, to force quick compliance before anyone had time to think. Each notice warned of additional penalties, enforcement action, and legal consequences if I failed to correct the violations. At the same time, the HOA began using my father's condition like leverage. One afternoon, a county social services worker showed up unannounced. She stood on the porch with a clipboard and explained, gently but firmly, that a complaint had been filed regarding unsafe living conditions and potential elder neglect. My father wasn't even living there. He was still in rehab, working to regain the use of his arm. But the accusation landed anyway, heavy and humiliating. It didn't matter that it was false. What mattered was that it existed on paper now, a mark that could be referenced later if things escalated. I tried to speak to Vanessa in person, hoping that maybe this had all spiraled out of control and could still be corrected. She listened without interrupting, her expression almost bored. When I finished, she smiled softly, like a therapist humoring a difficult patient. "You're emotional," she said. "That's understandable, given your family's situation. But the association has to focus on continuity and safety. Continuity, safety." She repeated those words like they were shields, like they couldn't possibly be questioned. But I could see what she was doing now. She wasn't protecting anyone. She was constructing a narrative. Every letter, every fine, every complaint was another brick in a wall designed to make me look reckless and unstable if I pushed back. The conflict turned physical. The afternoon Lily ran into the house, breathless, saying there were men down by the creek. I walked down and found two contractors with a mini excavator already chewing into the soil. They worked with the casual confidence of people who believed they were untouchable. I asked who hired them. One of them didn't even look embarrassed. He shrugged and pointed to a clipboard. "HOA water maintenance," he said. The work order was stamped with the Silver Pines Ridge logo. I told them to stop immediately. They didn't. One of them laughed under his breath and said, "Lady in charge says this is association infrastructure." I stood there, watching dirt pile up near the spring my father had protected his entire life, and felt something in me harden. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a test of who would back down first. That night, Lily sat beside me at the kitchen table and quietly slid her phone across the surface. She'd taken photos without anyone noticing. Close-ups of the equipment, clear shots of the workers' faces, license plates, the stamped work order. Time-stamped proof. She didn't realize it then, but she had just started the file that would change everything. I called the county the next morning and asked about permits and easements. I was transferred from one department to another until a tired-sounding clerk finally lowered her voice and said, "Sir, you should talk to the commissioner." The commissioner's name was Marcus Keene. A little digging made the connection painfully clear. Marcus Keene was Vanessa Rourke's brother-in-law. That was the moment my anger cooled into something far more dangerous, because this wasn't just an HOA overstepping its bounds. It was a connected system protecting itself. And now that I could see the shape of it, I knew this fight wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be precise. My father came home for a short weekend visit, and the house felt different the moment he rolled through the door. He moved slowly now, his right side stiff, his words thick with effort, but his eyes were still sharp, still watchful. Lily stayed close to him, helping guide his wheelchair over the threshold while I bolted temporary rails into place and adjusted the ramp. For the first time since I'd returned to the land, it felt like something was being repaired instead of taken away. That illusion didn't last long. Late that morning, tires crunched on the gravel drive. Vanessa appeared again, this time flanked by two HOA board members and a sheriff's deputy. She looked exactly as she always did, calm, immaculate, and completely unbothered. The deputy stood slightly behind her, hands folded, already framed as neutral muscle. Vanessa didn't waste time. She held up a document and spoke with practiced concern. "Mr. Dalton is not authorized to be on the property without an approved caregiver plan," she said. "The association is worried about liability." My father pushed against the arms of his chair, struggling to rise. The effort made his face flush and his hands shake, but he forced the words out anyway. "This is my land," he said, his voice raw but unyielding. Vanessa didn't flinch. She nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a predictable response. "The association will petition the county for emergency protective placement if necessary," she replied. "We have a duty to ensure his safety." There was no anger in her voice, no threat you could point to. Just procedure, clean and bloodless, used like a blade. After they left, my father sat in silence for a long time, staring out toward the lake. Later that afternoon, he asked Lily to take him down to the dock. He wanted to see the water again, he said. Just for a moment, I stayed back to take a call, convinced nothing would happen in broad daylight. 5 minutes later, Lily screamed. I ran downhill and found my father half sunk in mud near the shoreline, soaked through, his wheelchair tipped awkwardly on its side. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from the humiliation of it. A few feet away stood Vanessa, hands neatly clasped in front of her, speaking to the sheriff's deputy in a calm, instructional tone. "He attempted to access restricted HOA shoreline," she said. "We asked him to return to the designated path. He refused." My father looked up at me, and in his eyes was something I hadn't seen before, not anger, not fear, shame. Lily was crying openly, but her phone was raised, her hands steady despite the tears, recording every word. In that moment, the truth snapped into focus. Vanessa wasn't just enforcing rules or overstepping authority, she was manufacturing evidence. She wanted a scene that made my father look confused, incapable, and dangerous to himself. A moment that could be documented, filed, and later cited to justify removing him permanently. That night, after my father was asleep, I opened the old metal filing cabinet he'd kept locked for as long as I could remember. Inside were decades of careful records, hand-drawn maps, yellowed deeds, water priority filings, and a faded certificate confirming that our spring and lake carried senior rights dating back to the late 19th century. The surveys were precise, showing that the aquifer recharge zone originated entirely on our land. Then I found the document that changed everything. Tucked behind the others was an old maintenance agreement referencing a federal monitoring intake installed decades earlier. It was still valid, still enforceable, and still physically located on our property. The realization hit me all at once. The HOA wasn't maintaining an independent system. They weren't sharing water. They were tapping directly into our supply, feeding the entire ridge through infrastructure they didn't own and rights they never held. And suddenly, everything made sense. The aggression, the urgency, the way Vanessa spoke about continuity, like it was a life or death issue. If the water stopped flowing, even briefly, the illusion of control would collapse, which meant that what would happen next wouldn't be sabotage, it would be leverage. Lawful, documented, and undeniable. I stopped reacting to every letter and every threat and forced myself to slow down. Panic was exactly what Vanessa wanted. Confusion, too. So instead of arguing, I shifted into something far more dangerous, to her methodical focus. I started building a case. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls before the coffee even cooled. The first was to Aaron Sato, a former colleague and now a district engineer with Federal Inspection Authority. Aaron wasn't the kind of person who offered comfort or encouragement. She dealt in facts. When I explained what I'd found, she asked me to send everything: maps, surveys, water priority filings, and the old maintenance agreement. There was a long silence on the line after she opened the files. Long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. Then she spoke carefully. "If that intake is active," she said, "and they're drawing from it without proper authorization, this isn't an HOA issue anymore. This is a regulatory problem." That was all I needed to hear. The second call went to Calvin Ross, a forensic accountant I'd worked with years earlier on a municipal project that turned ugly when contractors were caught double billing for maintenance that never happened. Calvin had a gift for seeing patterns where others saw spreadsheets. I asked him a simple question: could he trace the HOA's water maintenance payments if I could get my hands on the records? "Yes," he said without hesitation. But you'll need minutes, contracts, invoices, the boring stuff. Especially the boring stuff. So I played Vanessa's game. I leaned into procedure. I filed formal document requests under state HOA transparency laws. I asked for board meeting minutes, vendor contracts, payment schedules, and maintenance invoices going back several years. The HOA responded exactly the way I expected. They delayed. They claimed exemptions. Then they sent a partial packet with entire sections blacked out, as if thick black lines could erase financial reality. Calvin laughed when I forwarded the files, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. When people redact this aggressively, he said, they're not protecting privacy, they're hiding patterns. While the adults played chess with paperwork, Lily quietly became my most reliable asset. She documented everything without being told. Signs that shifted position overnight. Contractors who returned to the creek like nothing had happened. Every letter that arrived in the mail, photographed before it was opened. Every envelope, every timestamp, every posted notice nailed to a tree. She even recorded Vanessa speaking at a so-called community update, calmly telling neighbors that my father was a safety risk and that the HOA was doing what the family refused to do. Lily didn't argue with her. She didn't confront her, she just recorded. Then came something I hadn't planned for. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, there was a knock at the door. A quiet older woman stood there holding a pie, her hands slightly trembling. She introduced herself as Ruth Ellison, a longtime resident who lived closer to the ridge than the lake. She didn't sit right away. She glanced toward the trees like she was checking to see who might be listening. "They've done this before," she whispered. "Not exactly like this, but close enough." Ruth told me about families who'd lived in the area long before Silver Pines Ridge existed, families who suddenly lost easements, families who were hit with code violations that appeared out of nowhere, families who received alarming letters about water contamination risks right before being pressured into selling. She didn't sound angry, she sounded worn down, like someone who'd watched the same story repeat itself too many times. "They squeeze," she said quietly, "paper first. Then pressure. Then people leave." I asked her one question, watching her face carefully. "Do you know where the ridge's water actually comes from?" She didn't hesitate. She looked past me, toward the lake. "Same place it always has," she said. "Your spring." That night, after the house went quiet, I followed the creek upstream with a flashlight. I pushed through brush until I found it, the intake, half hidden by overgrowth, exactly where the old survey said it would be. I brushed dirt off the valve housing and felt my pulse spike when I saw the faded marker. It was tied to the old federal monitoring program. Still there. Still real. Standing there in the dark, I made the hardest decision of the entire ordeal. I didn't shut the water off completely. That would have crossed a line. Instead, I reduced the flow, just enough to create pressure loss, just enough that the ridge would feel it and start asking questions. Then I sent Aaron the coordinates and scheduled the inspection for the next morning. If Vanessa wanted a crisis to frame me as the villain, I was going to make sure that crisis unfolded with federal inspectors standing in plain view, clipboards in hand, documenting every lie as it collapsed under its own weight. The HOA meeting that week felt nothing like the ones people joked about online. There were no folding chairs half empty, no bored residents checking their phones. The room was packed wall to wall, people standing along the sides and spilling into the hallway. Nobody was there to argue about lawns or paint colors. They were there because their faucets had started coughing air, because showers ran cold and weak, because fear travels faster than any notice ever mailed by an association. Vanessa opened the meeting with the same polished confidence she always carried. She stood at the front like a corporate spokesperson during a crisis briefing, hands relaxed, voice measured. She didn't accuse the HOA of failure. She didn't even acknowledge the missing water directly. Instead, she framed the problem carefully. "We have reason to believe," she said, scanning the room before letting her gaze settle on me, "that a single landowner has been interfering with community water stability. Her tone softened as she delivered the verdict. This behavior is dangerous, and frankly, it's selfish. Every head turned. I felt the weight of it immediately. Hundreds of people who had woken up scared, angry, and desperate for someone to blame. And in that moment, I understood what Vanessa had built for herself over the years. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was the person who made problems invisible. The person who kept things running. If something broke, the story had to be that an outsider broke it. I stood slowly, keeping my hands visible, my voice steady. "I'm not your enemy," I said, "but I'm not your supply closet either." I asked for documentation. I asked for easements. I asked for permits. What I got instead were threats and fines. Vanessa smiled faintly, the way someone does when they believe they're winning. "The association follows procedure," she replied, "unlike you." That was when the room shifted. The doors opened and Aaron Sato walked in, flanked by two inspectors, one from the state, one federal. Aaron didn't look impressed or angry. She looked focused. She introduced herself clearly, then addressed the room as if Vanessa weren't even standing there. "I'm here to review water sourcing documentation for Silver Pines Ridge," she said. "Specifically, permits authorizing extraction from the Dalton Spring system." The silence that followed was heavy. Vanessa's expression barely changed, but her eyes flickered just once. She attempted to regain control, explaining that all documentation would be provided through legal counsel. Aaron nodded politely. "Understood," she said. "In that case, we'll proceed with an immediate site inspection. Any refusal or obstruction will be documented." The murmurs began then. Not outrage. Confusion. Because for years, Vanessa had trained this community to believe that paperwork was authority. And now, someone with more of it had arrived and wasn't asking permission. After the meeting adjourned, Vanessa found me near the back hallway. Her voice dropped, soft and intimate, like she was offering advice. "You're making yourself look unstable," she said, "and if anything happens to your father, the county won't be forgiving." It was concern wrapped so tightly around a threat that it almost sounded reasonable. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. A message from Lily. She'd been wandering the hallways, unnoticed. The video she sent made my stomach drop. Vanessa, speaking quietly to a contractor, instructing him to make sure invoices were cleaned up before anyone asked questions. Calm. Confident. Recorded. Vanessa didn't know it yet, but she'd just spoken her way into evidence. That night, Calvin called me. His voice was tight, energized in the way it gets when a puzzle finally clicks. "The vendor payments circle back," he said. "Different company names. Same endpoints. HOA maintenance funds are feeding a small network tied directly to Vanessa's household." I sat at the kitchen table long after the call ended, staring at the paperwork spread in front of me. This was no longer about my land or even my father. It was about an entire community being managed through a quiet system of control, one built on fear, paperwork, and redirected money. And Vanessa was cornered. Because there was no clean exit left. If she admitted the truth, everything she'd built collapsed. If she kept pushing, the records would bury her. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel angry. I felt calm, because systems like hers don't fall apart from shouting. They fall apart when the documents start telling the truth on their own. The next morning, everything broke at once. Silver Pines Ridge woke up to a kind of silence people don't notice until it's wrong. Faucets hissed and spat air. Showers never warmed. Coffee makers stalled halfway through their cycle. It wasn't a total shutdown, just enough pressure loss to trigger panic. Within minutes, doors flew open and people stepped into the street holding empty buckets and jugs, trying to understand how an entire neighborhood could fail overnight. Phones lit up. HOA group chats exploded with accusations, fear, and rumors stacking on top of one another faster than anyone could verify them. And right on cue, Vanessa arrived at my property with the sheriff. Her stride was confident, rehearsed, like she'd practiced this walk in her head. That confidence lasted exactly until she noticed the trucks already parked near the trailhead, state markings, federal markings, inspectors unloading equipment. Her composure cracked just enough to show she hadn't planned for this part. She moved quickly, stepping in front of the sheriff as if to control the narrative before it could drift. "He's sabotaging the community," she said firmly. "I warned everyone. This landowner is dangerous. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I simply handed the sheriff a packet of documents, property maps, senior water rights filings, and the old maintenance agreement that proved the intake had never belonged to the HOA. Then I handed Aaron Sato a second packet containing Lily's videos, photographs of the contractors, and a clean timeline of every threat, fine, and notice the HOA had issued. Vanessa tried one last maneuver. She declared an emergency, invoked association authority, and ordered contractors to move on to my land immediately. It was a bold move, one that relied entirely on momentum and intimidation. Aaron stopped her with a single question. "Do you have legal access rights to this intake?" Vanessa opened her mouth. "The HOA maintains." Aaron cut her off without raising her voice. "Do you have legal access rights?" Vanessa didn't answer. Not because she wouldn't, but because she couldn't. That was when Lily stepped forward. Her hands were shaking, but her voice didn't break. "I have a recording," she said. She played the video from the dock. Vanessa's calm voice filled the air as my father lay half submerged in mud, his wheelchair tipped, his dignity stripped away under the guise of safety. The sheriff watched the screen without blinking. When the video ended, his expression had changed completely. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, disgust. The people gathered nearby began to murmur, not outrage yet, but doubt. Because Vanessa's authority had always depended on her image as a protector, a calm administrator acting in everyone's best interest. The video showed something else entirely: calculation, indifference, and cruelty dressed up as procedure. Then Calvin arrived, carrying printed charts and ledgers. He didn't accuse. He didn't editorialize. He laid out the numbers: maintenance payments routed through vendors, vendor payments looping back through shell entities, the same financial endpoints repeating under different names. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was clear. Aaron and the inspectors moved with quiet efficiency. They photographed the intake, logged measurements, documented the unpermitted extraction and the dependency chain that tied the entire ridge to a single, unauthorized source. No speeches. No theatrics. Just notes, cameras, and official notices being issued one by one. That was the moment the balance shifted. Vanessa had always believed paper was power. Forms, letters, procedures. She built her authority on the idea that whoever controlled the documents controlled reality. Now, those same documents were dismantling everything she'd built. Once the inspections were underway, something shifted across the ridge. The anger that had been aimed at me lost its footing and began searching for a new place to land. People who had been shouting accusations days earlier started asking questions instead. Quiet at first, then louder, sharper, harder to deflect. They wanted to know why the HOA had never clearly disclosed where the water actually came from. They asked why permits were missing, why records were incomplete, why so many invoices were heavily redacted for something as basic as routine maintenance. They asked why every so-called emergency repair carried a massive price tag and yet somehow never resulted in a more stable system. And most importantly, they asked why none of this had ever been shared with the homeowners footing the bill. Vanessa tried to keep control the only way she knew how, by leaning on procedure. She attempted to call meetings to order, reminded people of proper channels, and urged them to remain calm while matters were reviewed. But the room no longer responded to her voice. The authority she'd cultivated for years dissolved the moment people realized how much had been hidden behind it. The institutional unraveling happened quietly, without spectacle. The county commissioner, Marcus Keene, abruptly announced his recusal from any HOA-related enforcement matters. It was phrased carefully, wrapped in legal language, but everyone understood what it meant. He'd been told to step away. Shortly after that, the judge, whose name kept appearing in whispered conversations, filed a conflict notice once Aaron's agencies became formally involved. The network that had protected itself for so long began disconnecting piece by piece. My father's situation changed just as quickly. The social services complaint that had hovered over him like a threat lost its power once Lily's footage and the sheriff's report were entered into the record. The shoreline incident was no longer framed as elder neglect. It was recognized for what it was: deliberate provocation designed to manufacture evidence. The weight that had been pressing on my father's dignity lifted, and for the first time in weeks, he slept through the night without waking in a panic. There were no dramatic arrests, no televised press conferences. What happened instead arrived in envelopes, formal letters, notices of removal. Vanessa was suspended from the board pending investigation. HOA counsel resigned, citing irreconcilable concerns. The maintenance vendor stopped returning calls altogether. One by one, the pillars that supported the illusion of normalcy gave way. Water service was restored gradually and lawfully after state and federal agencies imposed temporary oversight and demanded a new extraction plan that complied with actual regulations. The process wasn't smooth. People were inconvenienced, schedules were disrupted. But the mood across the ridge had changed. Frustration remained, but it was no longer fueled by lies. People can tolerate inconvenience far better than deception. Neighbors began coming to my door in ones and twos, never in groups. The apologies were quiet, uncomfortable. One man admitted he'd been told my father was refusing to cooperate and putting the community at risk. A woman confessed she'd been warned that I was unstable and looking for a fight. None of them sounded malicious. They sounded embarrassed. That, more than anything, revealed Vanessa's real strategy. She hadn't relied on force, she'd relied on isolation. Paint the target as unreasonable. Seed doubt. Let procedure do the rest. Once someone's reputation is compromised on paper, it doesn't take much pressure to finish the job. But evidence doesn't care about reputation. It doesn't bend to narrative. It simply sits there until enough light reaches it. And once it does, reality reasserts itself whether anyone is ready for it or not. An interim HOA president was appointed while investigations continued. His name was Thomas Weller, a retired water attorney who spoke without embellishment and refused to sugarcoat the past. He didn't attack the community, and he didn't pretend the association was blameless. In his first address, he said one sentence that settled the room. This association will not survive if it operates like a private kingdom. Months later, my father asked to be taken down to the dock again. This time, he moved more steadily in his chair, his hands surer on the rails. He sat quietly and watched the surface of the lake ripple under the late afternoon sun. I didn't interrupt him. I could see it in his posture, in the way his shoulders relaxed. Something had been returned to him, not just access but dignity. The land was still 1,000 acres. The responsibility hadn't grown lighter or simpler. But the air felt different, clearer. For the first time since I'd come home, it felt like the ground beneath us belonged to the truth again. When I look back on everything that happened, the part that stays with me the most isn't the morning the water failed or the panic that followed. It isn't the fines stacked in my mailbox, the legal language meant to scare me into silence, or even the way an entire community was turned against me almost overnight. What haunts me is how quiet it all was. Vanessa never raised her voice. She never slammed doors or shouted threats. She smiled. She nodded. She wrapped every move in paperwork, forms, allegations, carefully worded concerns, and official letters designed to look final and unquestionable. And little by little, people began to accept her version of reality simply because it was written down. I used to believe power looked loud. I thought it lived in intimidation, in shouting matches and visible force. Now I understand that real power often wears a calm expression and speaks in polite sentences while it rearranges your life without asking. My dad is still changed by the stroke. He moves slower now, and some days his words come out heavy, but he's home. Most mornings, he sits on the porch and watches the sunlight slide across the lake, as if the water itself is reminding him that some things endure. Lily keeps her phone charged like it's a part of her now. She learned early that feelings can be dismissed, but proof can't be ignored. And I learned this: if an HOA or anyone ever tries to claim your home as theirs, you don't win by yelling. You win by staying steady, documenting everything, and letting the truth do what it always does in the end. It waits. And then it outlasts the lie. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?